string quartet was playing a delicate Vivaldi piece, the notes drifting upward to reflect off the vaulted glass ceiling of the conservatory. 500 of New York's absolute elite stood on the polished marble floor, their diamonds catching the glow of 3,000 suspended crystal lights. It was the centennial gala of Vance Holdings, the undisputed crowning achievement of Julian Vance's career. Standing in the shadow of a massive marble pillar, Eleanor Vance watched the crowd. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, deliberately understated. She was the architect who had designed this very building, the silent force who had spent 4 years stabilizing Julian's chaotic visions into a concrete empire. Yet she stood alone. Then, Julian's hand closed around her elbow. It was not a husband's touch. It was a clamp, hard, bruising, impatient. In here, he murmured, his voice a low, perfectly modulated hum beneath the music. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed across the room, specifically on a cluster of flashbulbs near the main bar. Eleanor allowed herself to be guided, her champagne glass perfectly balanced in her free hand. He pushed open the heavy oak door of the founder's viewing room, pulling her inside and snapping the lock shut. The heavy mahogany walls instantly severed the music and the laughter, leaving a thick, suffocating silence. Julian let go of her arm. He didn't offer a drink. He didn't smile. He simply walked to the grand mahogany desk, picked up a thick manila envelope, and dropped it onto the leather blotter. The sound was flat final. "I have had my attorneys draft this," Julian said. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, his movements efficient and utterly devoid of hesitation. "I want you to sign it by tomorrow morning." Eleanor stared at the envelope. For 3 seconds, her brain simply refused to translate the words. The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her crystal glass, the faceted edges biting into her skin. "I drafted what?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it seemed too loud in the dead air of the room. "Our divorce agreement," Julian said. He looked at his platinum Patek Philippe watch, clearly calculating how many minutes this inconvenience would cost him. "It is extremely generous, Eleanor. A $2 million settlement plus the summer house in the Hamptons. You will be very comfortable." A chill, sharp and violent, started at the base of Eleanor's spine and shot up to her throat. She could not breathe. Her ribs felt as though they had been bound in iron. 4 years. 4 years of working until 3 a.m. to fix his financial blunders. 4 years of smiling at investors who ignored her. 4 years of believing they were building a legacy together. "Julian?" Her voice trembled, betraying her. "Why, what is this?" "It's strategy, Eleanor," he said, looking at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a man evaluating a depreciating asset. "Vance Holdings is entering its global phase. I need a partner who reflects that ambition. Someone with the right social leverage, the right pedigree, the right capital." "And I don't," she asked, her wet lashes blinking rapidly as a humiliating, stinging sensation built in her eyes. "You were excellent scaffolding, Eleanor," Julian said, his tone softening into something that sounded disgustingly like pity. "You brought stability when I took over the company. But you are too quiet. Too background. Look at you tonight. It is the biggest night of my life, and you are hiding behind a pillar. I am standing behind a pillar because you told the press this building was designed by a foreign firm, not your wife." Eleanor's voice finally cracked. Julian's jaw tightened. "Don't be hysterical. It's done. I am merging with Croft Enterprises next month." The name dropped between them like an anvil. Croft Enterprises, which meant Vanessa Croft. Vanessa with her platinum hair, her loud abrasive laugh, and her father's billions. Vanessa, who had been lingering around Julian's office for the past 6 months under the guise of synergy meetings. "You are replacing me," Eleanor whispered, the realization draining the blood from her face. "With Vanessa." "Vanessa and I have an understanding," Julian corrected smoothly. "In fact, she is waiting in the VIP lounge right now. We are going to make our first public appearance together before the final toast tonight." Eleanor's vision blurred. The man standing before her, the man she had loved, defended, and poured her soul into, was a stranger. He was throwing her away with the casual indifference of a man discarding a used napkin. He wasn't even granting her the dignity of waiting until the gala was over. "Now," Julian stepped forward, his tone dropping into a commanding managing register. "I have arranged a private car at the loading dock, the service entrance. You can slip out through the kitchen corridor without anyone seeing you. Go back to the penthouse, pack what you need, and be gone by noon tomorrow. I will have my assistant send your remaining boxes later." The service entrance. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The loading dock. The place where the garbage was taken out. He wanted the woman who had literally drawn the blueprints for this building to sneak out through the trash exit so he could parade his wealthy mistress under the chandeliers she had hung. A heavy, suffocating numbness spread through Eleanor's chest. The trembling in her fingers stopped. The tears that had been threatening to spill suddenly dried up, replaced by an icy, devastating calm. She looked at the manila envelope. She looked at Julian's perfectly styled hair, his arrogant posture, his absolute certainty that she would bow her head, cry quietly, and disappear out the back door like a dutiful, broken little wife. He expected her to be convenient. He expected her to disappear. Eleanor took a slow, deep breath. Her spine straightened vertebra by vertebra until her posture was rigid, elegant, and entirely composed. Her heartbeat, which had been racing in panic, slowed to a steady, glacial rhythm. "The loading dock," Eleanor repeated, her voice no longer shaking. It was smooth, cold, and entirely flat. "It's for the best," Julian said, misreading her silence as submission. "It avoids a scene. You were never good with crowds anyway, Eleanor. Go home." Eleanor slowly set her half-full champagne glass down on the mahogany desk next to the divorce papers. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Julian's with a sudden piercing clarity that made him instinctively take a half-step back. "No," Eleanor said softly. Julian frowned. "No, Eleanor, do not make this difficult." "I am not going to the loading dock, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. She turned her back on him and placed her hand on the cold brass handle of the heavy oak door. "If you are replacing me tonight, I think I should at least say goodbye." Eleanor turned the heavy brass handle. The sharp click of the lock disengaging sounded like a gunshot in the deadened silence of the founder's room. Julian lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist, but he was a fraction of a second too late. She pushed the heavy oak door open, and the sudden, overwhelming cacophony of the Gala washed over them both. The delicate strings of Vivaldi, the clinking of crystal, the low roar of 500 wealthy conversations, it all rushed back in breaking Julian's suffocating control. He froze, his hand dropping to his side. Out here under the blinding glow of 3,000 suspended crystal lights, he could not be the ruthless dictator of the mahogany room. Out here he had a camera-ready facade to maintain. Eleanor stepped out of the shadows. She did not run. She did not lower her head. Instead, she squared her shoulders, her chin lifting with a terrifying, absolute grace. Her emerald silk gown, which had seemed so modest while she hid behind the pillar, suddenly caught the light, shifting and rippling like deep water. The stilettos of her black heels struck the polished marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic precision. Click, click, click. She knew this floor. She had chosen the marble herself, fighting the contractors for 6 weeks to ensure the gray veining perfectly mirrored the structural steel of the vaulted ceiling above. She knew every inch of the glass conservatory. It was her masterpiece, and she refused to sneak out of her own masterpiece like a criminal. Behind her, Julian hissed her name under his breath, a desperate warning sound. "Eleanor, stop right now!" He was following her, keeping a polite 3-pace distance, smiling tightly for the benefit of a passing board member while his eyes bored holes into her spine. He expected her to turn toward the kitchen corridor. He expected her to obey. But Eleanor did not turn toward the kitchens. She walked directly into the center of the grand hall. The crowd naturally began to part. There was something magnetic, something entirely unnerving about the way she moved. For 4 years, Eleanor Vance had been practically invisible, a quiet accessory draped on Julian's arm, famous only for her soft-spoken nature and her tendency to avoid the press. But the woman walking across the floor now possessed a devastating, cold gravity. The ambient noise of the room began to dip like a wave pulling back from the shore. Near the velvet ropes of the VIP lounge, standing directly beneath the grand chandelier, was Vanessa Croft. Vanessa was a vision in metallic silver, her dress designed to reflect every flashbulb in the room. She was surrounded by a small court of sycophants, holding a flute of vintage champagne and laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made. She looked victorious. She looked like a woman who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom. Eleanor walked straight toward her. As the distance closed, Vanessa noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere. She turned, the arrogant smile still plastered on her painted lips, and saw Eleanor approaching. For a split second, a flicker of genuine alarm crossed Vanessa's eyes. She glanced past Eleanor to Julian, who was currently trapped behind a group of Japanese investors, his face a mask of restrained panic. Vanessa recovered quickly, her posture stiffening. She clearly assumed Eleanor was coming to make a scene, to weep, to beg, to scream insults like a hysterical broken wife. Vanessa's chin lifted, readying her most condescending expression of pity. "Eleanor," Vanessa said smoothly as Eleanor came to a halt. Her voice was just loud enough to carry to the surrounding guests. "Julian told me you were leaving early. A headache, I believe." The guests standing nearby fell utterly silent. The tension was sudden and suffocating. 50 pairs of eyes locked onto the two women. Eleanor did not blink. She looked at Vanessa, taking in the expensive silver dress, the heavy diamond collar, the desperate need for validation rolling off her in waves. "I am leaving," Eleanor said. Her voice was neither loud nor rushed. It was perfectly level, carrying the chilling, elegant resonance of shattered glass. "But I realized I had something that belongs to you." Vanessa frowned, her manicured fingers tightening around her champagne flute. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Eleanor slowly lifted her left hand. The 3-carat diamond engagement ring and the solid gold wedding band caught the chandelier's light, flashing violently. With slow, deliberate movements that felt almost cinematic to the breathless spectators, Eleanor used her right hand to slide the rings off her finger. The gold dragged over her knuckle. It felt like shedding a chain. She held the rings suspended between her thumb and forefinger. She looked from the rings to Vanessa's perfectly powdered face, and then down to the crystal glass of champagne in Vanessa's hand. "You want my husband, Vanessa," Eleanor said softly, her words slicing through the absolute silence of the room. "You want the position, the company, and the man who views you as nothing more than strategic capital." Before Vanessa could process the words, Eleanor opened her fingers. The rings fell. They hit the surface of the champagne with a sharp, heavy clink, splashing a few golden drops onto Vanessa's immaculate silver gown. The heavy diamonds sank immediately to the bottom of the crystal flute, resting among the rising bubbles like a drowned anchor. Vanessa gasped, stepping back as if she had been burned, staring in sheer horror at her ruined dress and the rings sitting at the bottom of her glass. "You can have him," Eleanor finished, her voice utterly devoid of emotion. "But do try to remember the man who makes his wife leave through the loading dock will eventually do the same to his mistress." The silence in the conservatory was deafening. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. Even the waitstaff stood frozen. 500 of New York's most powerful people stared, their mouths slightly open, processing the absolute elegant brutality of what had just occurred. Eleanor did not wait for a response. She did not look back to see Julian's pale, furious face as he finally broke away from the investors. She simply turned on her heel, her emerald silk sweeping the marble, and walked toward the massive glass doors of the main entrance. She did not run. She walked with the unhurried, untouchable grace of a queen abandoning a crumbling throne. As she passed the press pit, the photographers, sensing the magnitude of the scandal, suddenly erupted. Flashbulbs exploded like lightning storms, capturing the image that would dominate every financial and society page by morning. Eleanor Vance walking out of her own gala, her head held high, leaving the CEO of Vance Holdings frozen in a silent, humiliated ballroom. The valet pulled open the heavy doors. The cold night air hit Eleanor's face sharp and clean. She walked down the stone steps into the dark, leaving the music and the lies behind her, stepping into the terrifying, magnificent void of her new life. The rain had begun to fall over Manhattan by the time the town car pulled up to the private residence entrance of the Vance Tower. It was a cold, driving rain that turned the city streets into slick black mirrors. Eleanor stepped out of the car, ignoring the driver's offered umbrella, and let the freezing drops hit her bare shoulders. The physical shock of the cold was grounding. It kept her tethered to the earth. She swiped her keycard and the private elevator initiated its silent, rapid ascent to the penthouse. When the polished steel doors slid open, she stepped into the massive, echoing foyer. The penthouse was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar monument to Julian's ego, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the glittering city below. Usually, Eleanor found the space suffocatingly large, but tonight, the absolute silence of the empty rooms was a physical weight. The heavy oak doors of the elevator clicked shut behind her, sealing her inside, and then the adrenaline evaporated. It did not fade. It vanished instantly, leaving a sudden crushing gravity in its wake. Eleanor's knees gave out. She collapsed onto the imported Italian marble floor, the rich emerald silk of her gown pooling around her like a spilled drink. For 4 years she had held her breath. She had molded herself into the perfect, quiet, accommodating wife. She had swallowed Julian's dismissals, justified his long absences, and convinced herself that their partnership was built on a foundation of mutual sacrifice. Tonight, that foundation had not just cracked, it had completely pulverized. A sharp, violent sob tore through her throat. The pain was entirely physical. Her chest felt as though it were being crushed in a vice. She gasped for air, but her lungs burned as if she were inhaling shattered glass. Her trembling fingers dug into the thick wool of the Persian rug, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against the fibers. She curled into herself, her forehead pressing against the cold floor, and wept. She did not cry for Julian. She cried for the 26-year-old girl who had believed his promises. She cried for the countless nights spent alone at her drafting table, drinking cold coffee while he was allegedly entertaining clients. She cried for the sheer staggering humiliation of having her life erased in a mahogany room while a foreign woman wore silver and waited to take her place. The penthouse absorbed her sobs, entirely indifferent to the breaking of its mistress. 10 minutes passed, perhaps 20. The storm outside lashed violently against the reinforced glass. Slowly, the ragged sound of her own breathing began to quiet. The shaking in her hands subsided into a dull, exhausted ache. Eleanor opened her swollen eyes, looking at the blurred reflection of the city lights on the wet floor. She forced herself to sit up. Her wet lashes fluttered against her cheeks, heavy and cold. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the expensive silk of her sleeve smudging her ruined makeup. The woman who had collapsed on the floor was the betrayed wife. The woman who stood up, using the marble console table for support, was someone entirely different. She walked down the long, shadowed hallway to the master suite. In the center of the massive dressing room, she pulled a single dark leather vintage suitcase from the top shelf. She opened it on the bed. She walked to her side of the closet, bypassing the rows of designer gowns, the Valentino silks, the Chanel tweeds, the Dior coats. Julian had paid for those. They were costumes purchased for the role of Julian Vance's wife. She left them hanging like ghosts. Instead, she packed 2 pairs of dark trousers, a few cashmere sweaters, tailored blouses, and a simple black coat she had bought herself years ago. Functional, quiet. Hers. Next, she moved to the vanity. The jewelry box sat on the polished surface, a heavy walnut chest inlaid with mother of pearl. She opened the lid. Inside lay millions of dollars in diamonds, sapphires, and pearls apology gifts for missed anniversaries, public relations props for charity galas. She did not touch a single piece. She left the lid wide open, a deliberate, silent statement of her absolute disdain for his wealth. She snapped the suitcase shut, but she was not finished. Eleanor bypassed the front door and walked to the far wing of the penthouse, entering her private architectural studio. This room was the only space Julian never entered. It smelled of graphite vellum and old paper. She approached the heavy steel safe hidden behind a drafting board. Her fingers steady now spun the dial, *3142. The heavy door clicked and swung open. Inside were not jewels or cash. Inside were the true foundations of Vance Holdings. When Julian had first started his aggressive expansion, his company had been a chaotic mess of bad investments. It was Eleanor's groundbreaking architectural designs and sustainable engineering patents that had won the global bids, saving him from bankruptcy. Because Julian considered the paperwork tedious, Eleanor had handled the legal filings herself. She reached into the safe and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. These were the original blueprints. More importantly, these were the intellectual property registrations. Signed, stamped, and legally binding under the name Eleanor Sterling, her maiden name. Julian had been so blinded by his own ego, so convinced that his wife was merely a convenient subordinate, that he had never bothered to check who actually held the rights to the core designs of his empire. He thought she was just the scaffolding. He didn't realize she owned the steel. Eleanor placed the folders into a waterproof leather portfolio and tucked it under her arm. She walked back to the foyer, pulling her single suitcase behind her. The wheels made a hollow, dragging sound against the marble. At the front door, she paused. She took the heavy, platinum-plated keycard to the penthouse from her clutch and dropped it onto the glass entry table. It landed with a definitive, final click. She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway. The collapsing silence of the penthouse was left behind. Eleanor Vance walked into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and stared at her reflection in the metal doors. Her eyes were red, her hair slightly disheveled, but her posture was flawless. She had nothing but one suitcase and a leather portfolio yet. As the elevator plummeted toward the ground floor, she had never felt more powerful. She stepped out into the freezing Manhattan rain, leaving the ruins of her marriage behind, and disappeared into the dark. It had been 6 weeks since the Centennial Gala. The social fallout had been swift managed with the kind of aggressive, highly funded public relations machinery that Julian Vance utilized best. Within 48 hours of Eleanor walking out of the glass conservatory, the official narrative had been meticulously planted in every major society column. The story was simple, tragic, and entirely fabricated. The quiet, fragile wife of the brilliant CEO had suffered a severe nervous collapse under the pressures of public life. To the elite circles of Manhattan, Julian was cast as the stoic, long-suffering husband who had finally been forced to make a difficult choice for the sake of his company. Vanessa Croft naturally was framed as his elegant savior, the modern dynamic woman who could stand by his side in the harsh spotlight. Julian sat behind the massive glass desk in his corner office on the 60th floor of the Vance Tower, looking at the latest issue of Elite Manhattan *. He and Vanessa graced the cover, standing on the balcony of his penthouse looking polished and invincible. Vanessa had already spent $2 million redecorating the penthouse, erasing every trace of the muted, elegant tones Eleanor had favored, replacing them with loud metallics and aggressive modern art. Julian tossed the magazine onto the desk, leaning back in his leather chair. He felt entirely untouchable. The merger with Croft Enterprises was entering its final legal review, promising to double his market share overnight. His life was finally reflecting the flawless image he had always demanded. But beneath the gleaming surface, the foundation of Vance Holdings was quietly beginning to fracture. The heavy glass door to his office swung open. Marcus Sterling, no relation to Eleanor but his chief operating officer for the past 3 years, stepped inside. Marcus did not look like a man working for an invincible company. He looked pale, exhausted, and holding a crimson file folder like it was a live explosive. "Julian, we have a situation with the Dubai development," Marcus said, bypassing the usual morning pleasantries and dropping the folder onto the desk right over Vanessa's glowing magazine cover. Julian sighed, an aristocratic sound of mild annoyance. "I thought we secured the zoning permits last Tuesday. Just wire the regional director the extra capital for the contractors." "It is not a capital issue," Marcus replied, his voice tight. "The primary contractors have halted all construction. The foundation poured for the central tower is cracking. The soil density reports do not match the load-bearing calculations for the structural steel." Julian frowned, a crease appearing between his perfectly groomed brows. "That is impossible. The blueprints were flawless. I pitched them to the Sovereign Wealth Fund myself. The concept blueprints were flawless, Marcus corrected carefully. But the localized engineering adjustments, the specific mathematical models required to adapt the design to the desert bedrock were never signed off. The contractors are refusing to proceed without the revised schematics. Then have the engineering department draft them immediately, Julian snapped, waving his hand dismissively. This is not a crisis, Marcus. It is an administrative delay. Marcus shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the floor before meeting Julian's gaze again. They can't. The senior engineers have been trying for a week. They do not understand the underlying algorithm used to balance the thermal expansion of the steel with the concrete load. It is a proprietary formula. The room fell quiet. The hum of the city traffic 60 floors below seemed very far away. What do you mean they do not understand it? Julian's voice dropped in temperature. They are the highest paid structural engineers on the East Coast. Yes, but they didn't design the core architecture, Julian, Marcus said, his tone bordering on desperation. Eleanor did. The name hung in the cold, air-conditioned air of the office. It was the first time anyone had spoken her name in this room in 6 weeks. Eleanor was the only one who possessed the complete structural models. Marcus continued pressing the uncomfortable truth forward. Whenever we hit a snag like this in the past, she would quietly revise the CAD files overnight. She functioned as the bridge between the design and the engineering teams. Without her translating the models, the engineering department is essentially looking at a locked safe without the combination. A sharp, unfamiliar spike of irritation pierced Julian's chest. He despised being reminded that his quiet, disposable wife had possessed any actual utility beyond social aesthetics. He had convinced himself that she was merely a talented draftswoman, someone who filled in the blanks of his grand visions. Fine, Julian said, his jaw clenching. Just access her private server on the mainframe, pull the master files, and hand them over to the new architectural firm Vanessa recommended. Let them reverse engineer it. Marcus hesitated. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight in the room. I already requested IT to do that, Marcus said quietly. Julian, the files aren't there. Julian froze. Explain that. Her personal server is completely empty, wiped clean. Then send someone to the penthouse, Julian ordered, his voice rising, the polished facade cracking just a fraction. She had a physical safe in her studio. Break it open if you have to. The physical blueprints must be there. I went to the penthouse myself yesterday while you were in the Hamptons with Vanessa, Marcus admitted, looking miserable. The safe was open. It was completely empty. Julian stared at his COO. The image of Eleanor leaving the Gala with nothing but a single vintage leather suitcase flashed into his mind. At the time, he had viewed it as the ultimate victory. She had walked away with nothing, too cowed to even demand her jewels. But a cold, insidious thought began to slither down the back of his neck. What exactly had been in that suitcase? She took sentimental sketches, Julian said, dismissing the thought with aggressive arrogance. He refused to entertain the idea that the woman who had wept on his floor was capable of strategic sabotage. She is a fragile woman who had a breakdown. She probably burned them in a fireplace out of spite. Julian, if we don't get those calculations, the Dubai project defaults in 14 days. The penalty clauses alone will cost us $300 million. I will handle it. Julian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, reclaiming his absolute authority. I'm not going to let a multi-billion-dollar empire stall because my ex-wife took some paperwork, have our legal team send her a cease and desist, threaten to sue her for corporate theft. That will terrify her enough to hand over whatever she took. Marcus nodded slowly, though the doubt in his eyes remained. He turned and left the office. Julian stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city he believed he owned. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, staring at the screen. He was Julian Vance. He did not need the quiet woman who used to sit in the shadows. He was the king. But as he looked out at the glittering skyline, a slight involuntary tremor passed through his fingers. He did not know it yet, but the throne he was sitting on was completely hollow, and the architect of his empire was already drawing the blueprints for his destruction. 6 months passed. To the outside world, Julian Vance was at the absolute zenith of his power. The merger with Croft Enterprises had infused Vance Holdings with billions in liquid capital, and Julian was ready to cement his legacy with his most ambitious project yet, the Vanguard. It was to be a 90-story marvel of sustainable architecture in the heart of Manhattan, a glass and steel titan that would redefine the city's skyline. The press conference for the official groundbreaking was held in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. 300 journalists, city officials, and international investors were seated before a massive stage. Julian stood at the podium, bathed in the blinding white light of camera flashes. He looked immaculate in a midnight blue bespoke suit. Sitting in the front row was Vanessa, draped in a couture red dress and wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than most residential blocks in the city. She smiled for the cameras, playing the role of the supportive, glamorous partner to perfection. The Vanguard is not just a building. Julian's voice resonated through the state-of-the-art sound system dripping with practiced charisma. It is a testament to human ingenuity. It is the future of Vance Holdings. And today, with the mayor of New York beside me, I am proud to officially sign the city contracts that will break ground on this historic monument. The crowd erupted into applause. The mayor stepped forward, shaking Julian's hand as an aide produced a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. The leather-bound contracts were opened on a velvet-draped table. Julian took the pen. He uncapped it, feeling the satisfying weight of victory in his hand. He lowered the gold nib to the thick parchment. "Julian, stop." The voice did not come over the microphone. It was a harsh, breathless whisper from the side of the stage. Julian paused, his pen hovering a fraction of an inch above the signature line. He glanced to his right. David Hart, the lead corporate counsel for Vance Holdings, was practically sprinting up the side stairs of the stage. David was a man who charged $2,000 an hour and had never been seen sweating in his life. Right now, his face was the color of old ash, and his forehead was slick with perspiration. Julian's smile tightened into a rigid, terrifying mask. "David," he muttered under his breath, keeping his face turned toward the cameras. "Get off the stage. I am signing the municipal agreements." "If you sign that contract, you will be committing federal fraud," David whispered, leaning in so close that Julian could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He shoved a crumpled legal document against Julian's chest, hiding it from the press behind the podium. "Put the pen down, now." The absolute panic in David's eyes sent a cold, violent shockwave straight down Julian's spine. Julian forced a brilliant, apologetic smile toward the mayor and the blinding wall of flashbulbs. "Ladies and gentlemen, a brief administrative delay. Please enjoy the champagne. We will proceed in exactly 2 minutes." He turned on his heel, his fingers gripping David's arm with enough force to bruise, and dragged the lawyer behind the heavy velvet curtains backstage. The roar of the ballroom was instantly muffled. Vanessa, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, abandoned her front row seat and hurried behind the curtain after them. "Julian, what is going on?" "The mayor looks insulted." Julian ignored her. He snatched the document from David's trembling hands. It was a federal injunction stamped with the red seal of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. "Explain this," Julian demanded, his voice a low, lethal hiss. "Why is a federal judge halting the Vanguard project?" "It's not just the Vanguard, Julian," David said, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his forehead. "It's the Dubai development. It's the London Annex. It's the entire Sustainable Architecture Division. The injunction freezes all construction, all fundraising, and all municipal contracting." Julian stared at him, the blood roaring in his ears. "On what grounds?" "We own those designs." "No," David swallowed hard. "We don't. We just received the filings 20 minutes ago. A holding company is claiming total intellectual property theft. They filed the original patents for the structural algorithms, the EcoGlass thermal regulation, and the core blueprints 4 years ago, long before Vance Holdings even existed as a corporate entity." "That is impossible," Julian snarled, pacing like a caged animal. "I oversaw the creation of those blueprints myself. Who is suing us?" "Which competitor?" David did not answer immediately. He looked at Vanessa, who was standing there in her millions of dollars of couture, utterly clueless to the corporate slaughter happening in front of her. Then David looked back at his boss. It is not a competitor, Julian. The plaintiff is the Sterling Architectural Trust. The name slammed into Julian's chest like a physical blow. Sterling. The sole proprietor and majority shareholder of the trust, David continued, his voice dropping to a grim whisper, is Eleanor Sterling. Vanessa let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Eleanor, your mousy ex-wife, Julian. This is ridiculous. Tell your lawyers to crush her. Shut up, Vanessa! Julian snapped, the venom in his voice so absolute that she physically recoiled. He turned back to David, his mind frantically trying to process the magnitude of the disaster. She cannot own the patents. She worked for me. It's corporate property. She didn't work for you, Julian. David corrected, his tone shifting from panic to the cold, hard delivery of legal reality. She was never an employee of Vance Holdings. She was never on payroll. Because you didn't want to pay her a salary or give her official credit, remember you told me it was cleaner to keep her off the books. Julian's breath hitched. A sickening, icy dread began to pool in his stomach. Because she was never an employee, the standard corporate ownership clauses do not apply to her work, David explained, delivering the final fatal blow. She handled all the initial legal filings for you. She quietly registered every single core patent, every algorithm, and every architectural blueprint under her maiden name in her own private trust. Julian, she legally owns 51% of the intellectual property that your entire empire is built upon. We can't lay a single brick without her permission. The velvet curtain shifted slightly as the distant sound of 300 reporters murmuring impatiently filtered into the backstage area. Julian stood frozen in the dim light. He remembered the night of the gala. He remembered handing her the divorce papers, demanding she leave through the loading dock. He remembered telling her she was just scaffolding. She hadn't taken the papers from the safe out of sentiment. She hadn't left her jewelry behind out of grief. She had left with the only thing that actually mattered, the one thing Julian had been too arrogant to protect. Julian, the mayor's aide, poked his head through the curtain, looking irritated. The mayor has another engagement in 20 minutes. Are we signing this or not? Julian looked down at the gold pen still gripped in his hand. It felt entirely useless. The king was still wearing his crown, but the woman he had banished had just quietly, cleanly, and legally seized his entire kingdom. The Astor Foundation's annual black tie charity event was the undisputed apex of the New York autumn social season. It was held in the grand atrium of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a sprawling space of ancient stone Egyptian relics and staggering wealth. For Julian Vance, attendance was mandatory. The Vanguard project had been publicly stalled for 2 weeks under the guise of municipal zoning delays, and Vance Holdings was bleeding millions in daily penalties. He needed to project absolute invulnerability. Julian stood near the Temple of Dendur, holding a glass of scotch he wasn't drinking. Vanessa was draped over his arm, wearing a blindingly loud magenta gown. She was currently explaining her interior design choices for the penthouse to the wives of 3 influential hedge fund managers. Julian nodded mechanically, his jaw aching from the effort of maintaining his practiced charming smile. Julian, a voice cut through the polite chatter. He turned. It was Richard Sterling, the publisher of the city's leading financial daily. Richard was staring past Julian's shoulder toward the grand entrance of the atrium. I thought you said your ex-wife was recovering in a sanatorium, Richard said, his tone thick with sudden predatory curiosity. Julian's blood turned to ice water. He turned slowly, dread coiling in his stomach like a physical serpent. The atrium had gone noticeably quiet. The usual symphony of clinking glasses and high society laughter was dropping section by section, replaced by an aggressive, buzzing murmur. The wall of society photographers stationed near the entrance suddenly erupted into a blinding storm of camera flashes. Eleanor Vance had arrived. Only she was not the quiet, accommodating woman who used to hide in the corners of his galas. She did not look like a woman broken by a public replacement. Eleanor wore a gown of midnight black velvet that clung to her frame with structural perfection, its sharp, asymmetric neckline framing her collarbones like a piece of modern art. A single flawless diamond dropped from a thin platinum chain at her throat, catching the light like a trapped star. Her dark hair was swept back, her posture impossibly straight, her chin lifted with the devastating calm of an executioner. But it was not just her appearance that had silenced the room. It was the man standing beside her. Alexander Pierce did not attend social events. He was a ruthless venture capitalist, a billionaire legal shark known for dismantling corporate empires for sport. He was a man who bought holding companies and liquidated them before breakfast, and right now his hand was resting lightly, respectfully, on the small of Eleanor's back as he guided her through the parting crowd. Julian's chest tightened so violently he could barely draw breath. Pierce. Eleanor had secured Alexander Pierce as her financial backer. The realization hit Julian like a sledgehammer to the ribs. "Is that Eleanor?" Vanessa gasped, her voice shrill enough to make the nearby hedge fund wives flinch. "What is she doing here? She isn't on the donor list. And who is that man? Did she hire an escort?" "Vanessa, shut up," Julian hisses, panic finally leaking into his voice. "Do not look at her." But it was too late. Eleanor was not hiding behind a pillar tonight. She was walking directly toward the center of the room, directly towards the most powerful cluster of investors in the atrium, directly toward them. The crowd parted for her like water. People who had ignored her for 4 years were suddenly captivated by the sheer terrifying gravity she exuded. Vanessa, utterly oblivious to the legal apocalypse Eleanor had unleashed on Vance Holdings, felt her territorial instincts flare. She saw her rival, the discarded mousy wife, stealing the spotlight at her event. Driven by sheer arrogant stupidity, Vanessa let go of Julian's arm and took 3 aggressive steps forward, placing herself directly in Eleanor's path. Julian lunged to grab Vanessa's wrist, but he missed. Eleanor," Vanessa said loudly. The surrounding conversations abruptly died. A dozen journalists instinctively stepped closer, raising their audio recorders. "I am surprised the security let you in. I suppose when you leave a marriage with nothing but a single suitcase, you have to crash charity galas just to get a free glass of champagne." A collective silent gasp rippled through the immediate circle of guests. It was a crude, tasteless attack, lacking any of the refined subtlety of high society. Alexander Pierce stopped. He looked at Vanessa with the amused clinical disgust of a scientist observing a particularly stupid insect. He opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor raised a single elegantly gloved finger to stop him. Eleanor looked at Vanessa. She did not flinch. She did not blush. Her dark eyes swept over the magenta gown, the heavy makeup, and the desperate insecurity practically vibrating off the other woman. "Vanessa," Eleanor's voice was smooth, cold, and perfectly projected. "It is a charity gala. I did not crash. I am a platinum sponsor. My trust purchased the table you are currently standing next to." Vanessa blinked, her confident sneer faltering. "Your trust, you do not have any money. Julian took everything." Eleanor offered a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. It was a terrifying expression. "Is that what Julian told you? That he took everything?" Eleanor shifted her gaze slowly to Julian, who was standing, frozen, his face the color of wet chalk. The press cameras were flashing relentlessly, now capturing his public paralysis. "Julian hasn't told you, has he?" Eleanor asked softly, though the silence in the room ensured every word carried. "Told me what?" Vanessa snapped, looking back and forth between them. "About the Vanguard project," Eleanor said. "About why the construction has stopped. He told the press it was a municipal delay. He told you he was a titan." She took one step closer to Vanessa, the scent of her expensive cold perfume cutting through the stagnant air. "He didn't tell you that Vance Holdings doesn't own a single blueprint it has built in the last 4 years. "That is a lie," Vanessa scoffed, though her voice wavered. "Is it?" Eleanor tilted her head. "Ask him why he is bleeding $3 million a week in penalties. Ask him why his legal counsel begged my attorneys for a settlement yesterday morning. Ask him why the man you bought new curtains for is currently facing federal fraud charges for attempting to sign contracts on intellectual property he does not own." The atrium erupted. Journalists began shouting questions, shoving their recorders toward Julian. The hedge fund wives stepped back, looking at Julian as if he were suddenly contagious. Vanessa turned to Julian, her face pale beneath her makeup. "Julian, what is she talking about?" Tell them she is lying. Julian opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was suffocating. He looked at the cameras, he looked at his furious, humiliated mistress, and finally he looked at his ex-wife. Eleanor did not look vindictive. She looked entirely indifferent, which was infinitely worse. She had not raised her voice. She had not shed a tear. She had simply stated the truth, and in doing so, she had shattered his carefully constructed facade into a million unfixable pieces. "Enjoy the champagne, Vanessa," Eleanor said, turning away with glacial elegance. "I paid for it." She placed her hand back on Alexander Pierce's arm and walked away the flashbulbs, tracking her untouchable exit, leaving Julian and Vanessa to be consumed by the absolute chaos she had left in her wake. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom on the 65th floor of Vance Holdings was toxic. It was 7:00 a.m. on Monday, less than 36 hours after the Astor Foundation Gala, and the financial bleeding had officially become a hemorrhage. The morning market had opened, and Vance Holdings stock was in absolute freefall, dropping 22% in the first hour of trading. Julian Vance stood at the head of the long-polished obsidian table. He had not slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie was slightly loosened, and the invincible aura he had cultivated for 4 years was visibly fraying at the edges. 12 members of the board of directors sat in the ergonomic leather chairs, their faces set in expressions ranging from grim disappointment to outright fury. "The stock is collapsing, Julian," Arthur Pendleton, the senior board member, stated. His voice was a dry, rasping sound that carried absolute authority. "The Vanguard project is paralyzed. The Dubai contractors are threatening to sue us for breach of contract. And the front page of the Wall Street Journal features your ex-wife publicly informing the world that our entire sustainable architecture division is built on stolen property." "It is not stolen," Julian snapped, slamming his hands down on the obsidian table. "It is a marital dispute over asset classification. My lawyers are filing an emergency motion to dissolve her injunction. We will tie her up in litigation for the next 10 years if we have to. The Croft merger will provide the capital we need to weather the storm." Arthur looked at Julian with cold, reptilian eyes. "Have you spoken to Richard Croft this morning?" Julian hesitated, a flicker of panic crossing his exhausted face. "Vanessa assured me last night that her father is still fully committed to the merger." "Vanessa is a socialite who throws drinks at charity galas," Arthur said brutally. "Her father is a businessman. Richard Croft called me at 6:00 a.m. He is pulling out. The merger is dead, Julian. He will not tie his family's capital to a company that doesn't even own its own foundational patents." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Julian felt as though the floor were suddenly tilting beneath him. The Croft merger was his lifeline. Without it, the penalties from the stalled projects would bankrupt Vance Holdings by the end of the month. "We can secure private equity," Julian stammered, his voice losing its commanding resonance, pitching into something dangerously close to begging. "I built this company. I will find a way." The heavy glass doors of the boardroom clicked. Every head in the room turned. Julian's chief operating officer, Marcus, who had been guarding the door, was stepping backward, his face drained of all color. Through the doors walked Eleanor Vance. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that looked like armor, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. There was no trace of the quiet woman who used to bring Julian coffee during late-night drafting sessions. She moved with the lethal, unhurried grace of a predator entering a cage full of wounded prey. Flanking her were 2 men in dark suits, Alexander Pierce's elite corporate litigators. Julian's shock instantly mutated into explosive rage. "Security!" he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at her. "Get her out of here. Marcus, call the guards right now." Marcus did not move. No one moved. Eleanor ignored Julian entirely. She walked straight down the length of the room, her heels clicking against the glass floor with a steady, rhythmic finality. She stopped near the head of the table, looking down at the 12 board members who held the fate of the company in their hands. "Good morning, gentlemen," Eleanor said. Her voice was smooth, cool, and perfectly measured. "I apologize for the interruption, but as I hold the intellectual property rights that constitute 70% of this company's total valuation, my legal team advised me that I have a vested interest in this meeting. You have no right to be here, Eleanor, Julian snarled, taking a step toward her. His face was flushed with ugly, desperate anger. This is a closed executive session. You are trespassing. Eleanor finally turned her gaze to him. The look she gave him was so devoid of warmth, so utterly empty of the love she had once held for him that it stopped him dead in his tracks. Sit down, Julian, she said softly. It was not a request. It was a command delivered with such devastating gravity that Julian's knees physically locked. Eleanor turned her attention back to Arthur Pendleton. One of her lawyers stepped forward and placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio onto the obsidian table. Let us skip the theatrics, Eleanor said, resting her fingertips lightly on the leather cover. Vance Holdings is effectively insolvent without my patents. The Croft merger is dead. No bank will lend you the capital to cover the default penalties in Dubai, and the Vanguard project is permanently frozen. You are facing bankruptcy in less than 3 weeks. Arthur stared at the portfolio. And you have a proposition, Miss Sterling. He used her maiden name, deliberately acknowledging her power. I do, Eleanor replied. I am prepared to transfer the exclusive licensing rights of all my patents, algorithms, and blueprints to Vance Holdings. I will unfreeze the Vanguard project today, and I will personally oversee the engineering adjustments for the Dubai contractors. A collective breath of relief swept through the board members. Julian let out a ragged exhale, a manic, triumphant smirk breaking through his panic. She was caving. He knew she was too weak to actually destroy the company they had built. She just wanted a payout. However, Eleanor continued, her voice slicing through the brief relief like a scalpel. She looked directly into Arthur's eyes. My transfer comes with 2 non-negotiable conditions. First, the Sterling Trust will receive a 40% equity stake in Vance Holdings, making me the single largest shareholder. Arthur's eyes widened slightly, but he gave a slow, calculated nod. And the second condition, Eleanor turned her head slowly. She looked at Julian, taking in his disheveled suit, his trembling hands, and the sudden, terrifying realization dawning in his eyes. The immediate, permanent termination of Julian Vance as Chief Executive Officer, Eleanor said, the words falling like blocks of ice. He will surrender his remaining shares to cover the corporate damages caused by his gross mismanagement, and he will be escorted out of this building within the hour. You bitch, Julian whispered the word, tearing from his throat. He lunged forward, but Alexander Pierce's lawyers smoothly stepped in his path, blocking him. You cannot do this. I built this company. I am the face of Vance Holdings. You were the face, Eleanor corrected her voice, dropping to a chilling whisper. I was the spine, and today, Julian, I am breaking you. She did not wait for his response. She walked past him, stepping up to the heavy leather chair at the absolute head of the table, Julian's chair. With a calm, deliberate movement, she sat down. She folded her hands on the obsidian table and looked at the board. Well, gentlemen, the new queen of Vance Holdings said, her eyes cold and commanding. Let's take a vote. The vote was unanimous. 12 hands raised in a silent, brutal execution of his corporate life. In less than 3 minutes, the empire Julian Vance had spent 4 years taking credit for was stripped from his grasp. He was not permitted to return to his corner office on the 60th floor. He was not allowed to gather his imported pens, his custom humidor, or the framed magazine covers that praised his visionary genius. Marcus, the man who had been his loyal chief operating officer, stood by with a blank expression as 2 heavy-set security guards, men who had practically bowed to Julian yesterday, stepped forward to flank him. The walk to the elevator felt like a funeral procession. The doors slid open and they descended to the lobby. When the polished steel doors parted on the ground floor, Julian's breath caught in his throat. Word had already spread. Hundreds of employees had abandoned their desks, crowding the grand lobby to watch the ousted king make his final exit. There was no sympathy in their eyes, only morbid curiosity and quiet murmurs. Julian kept his head down, his face burning with a toxic mixture of rage and absolute humiliation. They pushed him toward the front doors, but suddenly the head of security stopped. Not the front doors, Mr. Vance, the guard said, his voice flat, devoid of any respect. Press is already swarming the main plaza. Miss Sterling requested that we escort you out through the service entrance to avoid a scene. The service entrance, the loading dock, The exact words he had used to discard Eleanor 6 months ago were now being used to throw him out like yesterday's trash. It was a perfectly calculated poetic cruelty. Julian was marched down the sterile, fluorescent-lit kitchen corridor past the dumpsters and shoved out into the damp, garbage-scented air of the back alley. The heavy metal security door slammed shut behind him with a resonant, final clang. His access card was instantly deactivated. He was entirely alone. His private driver had already been reassigned to the new CEO. Julian had to walk 3 blocks in his bespoke suit just to hail a passing yellow cab, ducking his head to avoid the stares of pedestrians. "The Vance Tower residences," he snapped at the driver, his hands trembling as he pulled out his phone. He had 30 missed calls, 2 from his private wealth manager, 28 from reporters. None from Vanessa. He needed Vanessa. He needed her father's capital. The corporate damages lawsuit Eleanor had initiated was going to freeze his personal assets, but if he married Vanessa quickly, the Croft family lawyers could shield him. They could start over. He was still a brilliant strategist. He just needed a new board. The cab pulled up to his building. Julian bypassed the doorman, ignoring the man's sudden look of pity, and took the private elevator to the penthouse. When the doors opened, he stepped into a scene of absolute chaotic dismantling. The penthouse, which Vanessa had spent millions redecorating just weeks ago, was filled with professional movers. Expensive modern art was being wrapped in bubble wrap. Designer luggage was stacked near the foyer, and standing in the center of the living room barking orders at a moving foreman was Vanessa. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and a cashmere travel suit. "Vanessa," Julian breathed, stepping forward, desperate for an anchor in the wreckage of his life. "Thank God you are here. We have a massive problem. Eleanor staged a hostile takeover. She blackmailed the board." Vanessa did not rush into his arms. She did not offer a sympathetic smile. She turned slowly, lowering her sunglasses to the bridge of her nose, and looked at him with an expression of profound clinical distaste. "I know, Julian," she said coldly. "My father called me an hour ago. He also informed me that you are personally liable for the corporate default penalties. You are facing personal bankruptcy." So, I can fight it," Julian said, his voice pleading, stepping closer to her. "I just need your father's legal team. We need to accelerate the wedding. Once we are married, Eleanor can't touch." Vanessa let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Are you insane, marry you, Julian? My father is the one who tipped off the Wall Street Journal about your fraudulent contracts. The Croft family does not tether itself to sinking ships, and we certainly do not marry men who do not even own the company they claim to run." Julian froze, the blood draining completely from his face. "Vanessa, I left my wife for you." "No, you didn't." Vanessa snapped, her patience entirely evaporated. "You left your wife because you thought she was a liability and I was an asset. You traded up, and now I am doing exactly the same thing. You are a liability, Julian. You are broke. You are a public laughingstock, and you have absolutely nothing left to offer me." She signaled to the movers. 2 men picked up her heavy steamer trunks and carried them toward the elevator. "You cannot do this," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "I gave you everything, the penthouse, the galas." "You gave me a hollow throne," Vanessa corrected brutally. She stepped into the elevator, turning to face him as the doors began to close. "Eleanor was right at the gala. You are nothing but a facade. Goodbye, Julian." The steel doors slid shut. Julian stood alone in the massive, half-empty penthouse. The silence was deafening, pressing in on him from all sides. He walked mechanically to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering skyline that no longer belonged to him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an automated email alert from his private bank. * margin call warning. Accounts frozen pending litigation. He dropped the phone. It shattered against the marble floor. The next morning, Julian's total annihilation was complete. The headlines dominated every news outlet, every financial blog, every society column. * the empty suit Vance ousted. * the architect of revenge. Eleanor Sterling reclaims her empire. Side-by-side photos were splashed across the internet. On the left was Julian, looking pale, disheveled, and pathetic, as he was photographed hailing a yellow cab outside an alleyway. On the right was Eleanor, looking breathtakingly elegant, sitting in the CEO's chair of Vance Holdings, Untouchable and Supreme. He had traded a diamond for cheap glass. He had thrown away the only woman who had ever truly built him up, and in doing so, he had engineered his own absolute destruction. Julian sank to the cold marble floor of his empty apartment, buried his face in his hands, and finally, for the first time in his life, he wept. 3 weeks after the Boardroom Massacre, the rain returned to Manhattan. It was a freezing, unforgiving autumn downpour, the exact kind of violent storm that had battered the city the night Eleanor had packed her single leather suitcase. But this time it was Julian Vance who was standing out in the cold. He had lost absolutely everything. The banks had seized the penthouse. His private accounts, heavily leveraged against the Vance Holdings stock he no longer possessed, had been frozen by federal mandate. Vanessa had vanished completely, blocking his number the moment she stepped into the elevator, leaving him with the crippling debts he had incurred to fund her extravagant lifestyle. His elite circle of friends, the men who used to drink his scotch and praise his genius, suddenly treated him like a leper. He was currently living in a damp, cheap motel in Queens, facing an impending federal indictment for corporate fraud. He had spent his last $200 paying a disgraced private investigator to find her address. Julian stood outside the heavy wrought iron gates of a sprawling 5-story limestone mansion on the Upper East Side. It was a historic estate heavily secured, radiating an aura of quiet generational wealth. Eleanor had purchased it in cash. Julian was soaked to the bone. His off-the-rack trench coat clung to his shivering frame, entirely inadequate against the biting wind. His bespoke Italian leather shoes, the ones he used to meticulously polish before board meetings, were ruined by the oily puddles of the street. His hands were shaking violently as he reached out and pressed the brass intercom button. He pressed it again and again. "Eleanor," he begged into the speaker, his teeth chattering. "Please, it's Julian. I know you are in there." For 2 agonizing minutes, there was only the sound of the driving rain. Then the heavy oak front door of the mansion slowly opened. Eleanor stepped out onto the wide covered marble portico. The warm golden light of the grand foyer spilled out behind her, framing her like a portrait of absolute untouchable royalty. She wore a thick cream-colored cashmere wrap over a set of dark silk trousers, holding a steaming cup of tea in one hand. She looked rested. She looked radiant. The hollow exhaustion that had plagued her during their marriage was completely gone. She did not walk down the steps to the gate. She stood at the top, perfectly dry, looking down at him through the wet iron bars. A massive security guard stepped out of the shadows behind her, placing a hand on his radio, but Eleanor subtly raised 2 fingers. The guard paused, stepping back. She did not need protection from the pathetic, broken man standing in the street. "Eleanor!" Julian choked out. He gripped the freezing iron bars, pressing his wet face against the metal. "Please, talk to me!" Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. "You are trespassing, Julian. My security team is highly paid to prevent vagrants from loitering at my gates." "I have nothing left," Julian screamed, the sound tearing from his throat, echoing tragically down the empty, affluent street. "They took the company. They took the penthouse. The federal prosecutors are filing criminal fraud charges on Monday morning. I am going to prison, Eleanor. They are going to lock me up in federal prison." "Then you should probably call a public defender," she said. Her voice was not angry. It was not vindictive. It was terrifyingly indifferent. It was the voice of a woman speaking to a stranger who had asked her for directions to a place she did not care about. Julian's knees buckled. The sheer physical exhaustion, the paralyzing terror of prison, the absolute crushing collapse of his ego, it all finally gave way. He sank down, falling to his knees on the wet, unforgiving pavement. The rain plastered his thinning hair to his skull, washing away the last remnants of the invincible CEO. "I am sorry," he sobbed, the tears mixing with the freezing rain on his face. "I am so sorry, Elle. I was blind. I was an arrogant, stupid fool. Vanessa used me. Everyone used me. But you actually loved me. You built me. I know that now. I know you were the only real thing I ever had." He looked up at her, begging with every shred of dignity he had left. Please, I am begging you on my knees. Drop the corporate damages lawsuit. Just release enough of my personal funds so I can pay a defense attorney. I will do anything. I will disappear. I will never bother you again. Please, Eleanor, remember what we had. Remember the 4 years we spent together? Eleanor looked down at the weeping man kneeling in the gutter. She felt a strange, quiet stillness expanding in her chest. She had thought for months about what this moment would feel like. She had wondered if she would feel a rush of triumphant adrenaline or perhaps a lingering twinge of pity. But looking at him now, she realized the truth, the love she had once held for him, had been surgically removed the night he pointed her toward the loading dock. She felt absolutely nothing. "We had an arrangement, Julian," Eleanor said softly, her words floating clearly through the heavy rain. "You were excellent scaffolding for a while. You brought a loud voice to the company when I needed to stay in the background." Julian froze, his sobbing hitched in his throat. "But you are too chaotic, too, unstable." Eleanor continued, her tone perfectly mimicking the cold, clinical detachment he had used on her 6 months ago. "Look at you tonight. You are crying in the street." Julian stared at her in sheer horror as his own words, the exact words he had used to destroy her in the founder's room, were fed back to him wrapped in razor wire. "I am entering my global phase," Eleanor said, taking another sip of her tea. "I need partners who reflect that ambition. You do not fit the aesthetic anymore." Eleanor, please," he whimpered, his hands sliding down the wet iron bars in utter defeat. "You wanted a quiet divorce, Julian. You wanted a clean break. You wanted to make sure there was no scene," she said, her voice dropping to a glacial, devastating whisper. "You demanded I leave through the service exit so you could keep the chandeliers. Well, I kept the foundation, and I let your house of cards collapse." She turned around, her cream cashmere sweeping elegantly over the marble floor of the portico. "Eleanor, don't leave me out here, I'm begging you," Julian screamed, rattling the locked gates, his voice raw and broken, practically feral with panic. "Please." Eleanor paused at the heavy oak door. She glanced over her shoulder, her dark eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "It's strategy, Julian," she said softly. "Go home." She stepped inside, and the heavy oak door clicked shut, cutting off the warm light and plunging Julian Vance back into the freezing, inescapable dark. The gavel fell with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a breaking bone in the deadened silence of the federal courtroom. It was spring in Manhattan, 6 months after the rainy night at the iron gates. Julian Vance stood before the judge, a hollow, graying shell of the titan he had once pretended to be. He was not wearing a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. He was wearing the shapeless, muted khaki of a federal inmate. There was no one sitting in the gallery directly behind him. The elite circle of friends had evaporated. The sycophants had scattered. Vanessa Croft had quickly married an 82-year-old oil magnate to cover her own spiraling debts, legally binding herself to a man who treated her with the exact same dismissive, transactional cruelty she had once helped inflict upon Eleanor. "Julian Vance," the judge's voice was devoid of sympathy. "For the charges of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and gross financial mismanagement, you are sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole." Julian did not weep. He did not protest. His eyes simply stared blankly at the polished mahogany table of the defense stand. The heavy steel handcuffs were secured around his wrists. The cold metallic click was the final sound of his empire ending. He was escorted out of the side door, erased from the elite echelons of New York, destined to become nothing more than a cautionary tale in business textbooks. 3 miles away, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the 90 stories of flawless, eco-sustainable glass that formed the newest, most breathtaking addition to the Manhattan skyline. It was no longer called the Vanguard. Written in sharp, elegant silver lettering above the grand entrance was its true name, the Sterling Spire. Thousands of people, including the mayor, international dignitaries, and the entire global press corps, were gathered in the Grand Plaza for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Eleanor stood at the center of it all. She was not hiding in the shadows. She was not standing behind a pillar. She wore an impeccably tailored, blindingly white suit that radiated absolute power, a deliberate, striking contrast to the morning black she had worn during the Boardroom Massacre. The single flawless diamond still rested at her throat, catching the diamond light of the morning sun. Alexander Pierce stood 2 paces behind her, functioning not as a protector, but as a silent, respectful ally who recognized a queen when he saw one. The press cameras flashed relentlessly, a continuous wave of adulation. "Miss Sterling," a reporter called out, pushing a microphone forward. "Today, your ex-husband was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Do you have any comment on his downfall?" The plaza went entirely quiet, hanging on her every word. Eleanor turned her dark eyes toward the reporter. Her posture was impossibly straight. Her breathing controlled her face, a mask of devastating calm. She offered a small, elegant smile that did not reach her eyes. "I am an architect," Eleanor said, her voice smooth, cinematic, and perfectly projected. "I only concern myself with things that are built to last. What collapses from its own structural weakness is no longer my business." A ripple of awe swept through the press corps. It was the perfect untouchable response. She took the golden scissors from the mayor, sliced through the heavy silk ribbon, and the crowd erupted into deafening applause. Later that evening, long after the galas and the celebrations had ended, Eleanor returned home. She did not return to the limestone mansion. A month ago, Julian's former properties had been liquidated in a federal foreclosure auction. Eleanor had purchased the 60th floor penthouse for pennies on the dollar, paying entirely in cash. She swiped her platinum keycard and the private elevator initiated its silent ascent. When the polished steel doors slid open, she stepped into the massive foyer. She had ordered the contractors to strip away every ounce of Vanessa's loud, desperate metallics. The space was returned to a pristine, minimalist elegance. The heavy oak doors of the elevator clicked shut behind her, sealing her inside. Eleanor walked slowly across the imported Italian marble floor. The sharp heels of her stilettos struck the stone with a rhythmic, commanding precision. Asterisk click, click, click. The sound echoed through the sprawling, multi-million-dollar space. She stopped in the exact center of the foyer. It was the precise spot where a year ago she had collapsed in her emerald gown, crushing her ribs, gasping for air, and weeping for a man who had thrown her away like garbage. She looked down at the marble. The memory felt like it belonged to another lifetime, to a fragile girl who had not yet realized that she was made of steel. Eleanor walked to the crystal decanter resting on the mahogany console. She poured herself a single glass of vintage champagne. Her fingers did not tremble. Her chest was not tight. Her heartbeat was slow, steady, and entirely at peace. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the glittering, sprawling grid of New York City. Down there, millions of people were navigating their own lives, their own betrayals, their own survival. And right in the center of it all, piercing the night sky, stood the sterling spire, glowing like a beacon of her own resilience. She raised her crystal glass, the faceted edges catching the ambient light of the city. She drank the champagne in the silent, magnificent room. She had walked out into the freezing rain with nothing but one suitcase, and she had returned to own the entire skyline. Eleanor Sterling was not just surviving. She was untouchable.